What makes a man like Quentin Tarantino, Hollywood's blood-soaked enfant, terrible? Bull at the altar of the Western. The genre that shaped his most acclaimed works remains his obsession. Today, we're diving into the 13 films that the master himself calls the greatest Westerns ever committed to celluloid. These aren't just movies, they're Tarantino's film school. The Good, the Bad, and the Ugly, 1966. The best directed film of all time. That's not film school hyperbole. That's Tarantino's own declaration about Sergio Leone's masterpiece. Released in 1966, this spaghetti western redefined what the genre could be, taking the American western and injecting it with European artistry and moral ambiguity. Clint Eastwood's Man with No Name reaches his iconic peak here as Blondie, hunting for Confederate gold alongside Eli Wallach's Tuco and Lee Van Cleef's Angel Eyes. Leone transforms the American Civil War into an apocalyptic backdrop where alliances shift like desert sand. The director's obsessive attention to detail creates a world where extreme close-ups of squinting eyes become as dramatic as any gunfight. What makes this film Tarantino's favorite isn't just the stylized violence. It's Leone's revolutionary approach to time. Scenes unfold with agonizing patience, tension building like a stretched rubber band. The final cemetery standoff extends for nearly 5 minutes, with barely a word spoken, a sequence Tarantino has referenced as pure cinema. The film's influence on Tarantino is unmistakable. His penchant for Mexican standoffs, morally gray characters, and operatic violence all trace back to Leone's masterpiece. When asked about the film's impact, Tarantino remarked, "When I saw this as a kid, I realized movies could be more than just entertainment. They could be art that punches you in the face." Even the film's iconic score by Ennio Morricone has directly influenced Tarantino's work. The whistling theme became so culturally embedded that Tarantino couldn't resist borrowing Morricone's compositions for his own films, including The Hateful Eight, which finally won the composer his first competitive Oscar at age 87. Rio Bravo, 1959. If I'm depressed, I'll put on Rio Bravo and it makes me happy. Tarantino's love affair with Howard Hawks' Western isn't about gunslinging action, it's about hanging out with characters who feel like old friends. This 1959 classic represents the Western at its most confident and relaxed, a film more concerned with character dynamics than frontier justice. John Wayne stars as Sheriff John T. Chance, holding a dangerous prisoner while fending off the criminal's powerful brother. What elevates the film is the makeshift family that forms around Chance. Dean Martin's alcoholic deputy Dude, Walter Brennan's limping old-timer Stumpy, and Ricky Nelson's young gunslinger Colorado. Together, they create what Tarantino calls the perfect hangout movie. Hawks films these interactions with deceptive simplicity, allowing conversations to unfold naturally rather than rushing to the next action sequence. This approach directly influenced Tarantino's own dialogue-heavy style. Hawks taught me that characters talking can be more exciting than characters shooting. Tarantino once explained in an interview, "What particularly fascinates Tarantino is how the film balances masculine toughness with emotional vulnerability. Dean Martin's struggle with alcoholism plays out with remarkable sensitivity for a 1950s Western. When Dude's hands shake too badly to roll a cigarette, it's a moment of quiet devastation that rivals any gunfight." The film's influence extends beyond Tarantino. John Carpenter remade it as Assault on Precinct 13, and the basic premise, a lawman and unlikely allies holding out against overwhelming odds, has become a Hollywood staple. For Tarantino, however, it remains the ultimate comfort film, a world he revisits whenever real life feels too harsh. The Searchers, 1956. The Searchers isn't just the greatest Western ever made. It might be the greatest American film, period. Tarantino's assessment of John Ford's 1956 masterpiece echoes what many film scholars have argued for decades. Yet, what makes this film so crucial to Tarantino's canon is how it confronts the dark heart of the American West, and by extension, America itself. John Wayne delivers his most complex performance as Ethan Edwards, a Confederate veteran who embarks on a years-long quest to rescue his niece from Comanche captivity. The disturbing truth, gradually revealed, is that Ethan intends to eliminate her for becoming one of them. This exploration of racism and obsession transforms the traditional Western hero into something far more disturbing. Ford frames this psychological journey against Monument Valley's breathtaking vistas, creating a visual language that contrasts human smallness against the landscape's vastness. The film's famous doorway bookends, where Ethan stands isolated from civilization, have been referenced countless times, including in Tarantino's own The Hateful Eight. What Tarantino particularly admires is the film's willingness to embrace moral complexity. Ford was making a film about racism starring John Wayne, America's hero, as essentially a psychopath, Tarantino noted. That took guts in 1956. This unflinching examination of American mythology's darker aspects has clearly influenced Tarantino's own revisionist takes on genre cinema. The film's technical achievements remain stunning. Ford's use of VistaVision to capture the landscape created images of remarkable clarity and depth, while Max Steiner's score alternates between stirring adventure themes and unsettling motifs that underscore Ethan's questionable motives. Though initially received as simply another Western, The Searchers has grown in stature to become the urtext for filmmakers examining America's complicated relationship with its frontier past. Once Upon a Time in the West, 1968. Leone's ultimate Western, a film so perfect it feels like it was carved rather than shot. Tarantino's reverence for Sergio Leone's 1968 epic goes beyond mere admiration. It's closer to religious devotion. This deliberate, grandiose meditation on the Western myth represents Leone at the height of his powers, creating what many consider the spaghetti Western's crowning achievement. The film's opening sequence alone, nearly 15 minutes with barely a word spoken, demonstrates Leone's mastery. 3 gunmen wait at a train station with only ambient sounds: a creaking windmill, knuckles cracking, water dripping onto a hat. This sequence taught Tarantino the power of patient tension building, a lesson he's applied throughout his filmography. Henry Fonda's casting against type as blue-eyed villain, Frank represents one of cinema's great reversals. America's moral compass transformed into a cold-blooded child killer, shocked audiences, and demonstrated how the spaghetti Western could subvert Hollywood conventions. Tarantino would later employ similar casting against type with actors like John Travolta in Pulp Fiction. What particularly fascinates Tarantino is Leone's exploration of myth-making itself. Charles Bronson's harmonica-playing Avenger and Jason Robard's reluctant outlaw represent Western archetypes reaching their evolutionary endpoint. Claudia Cardinale's Jill embodies the civilization that will eventually render these archetypes obsolete. Ennio Morricone's score deserves special mention. Composed before filming began, Leone actually played the music on set to help actors understand the emotional rhythm of scenes. This integration of music and image creates a nearly operatic experience, with character themes functioning like leitmotifs in a Wagner composition. The film's deliberate pacing initially proved challenging for American audiences, but its reputation has only grown with time. For Tarantino, it represents cinema at its most confidently artistic. Leone understood that Westerns weren't about historical accuracy. They were about mythology, almost like samurai films set in Monument Valley. The Wild Bunch, 1969. The Wild Bunch changed everything. After that film, there was no going back to white hats and black hats. Tarantino's assessment of Sam Peckinpah's revolutionary 1969 Western cuts to the heart of why this film matters. Released in a year of profound social upheaval, it represented nothing less than the Western genre's violent reckoning with modernity. Set in 1913 along the Texas-Mexico border, the film follows aging outlaws led by William Holden's Pike Bishop as they plan one final score before retirement. What distinguishes Peckinpah's approach is his refusal to romanticize these men. They're brutal, compromised figures caught between two worlds, their code of loyalty the only thing separating them from complete moral bankruptcy. The film's violence, balletic, horrific, and presented in groundbreaking slow motion, shattered Hollywood conventions. Bodies don't just fall, they dance macabre ballets as bullets tear through flesh and blood erupts in crimson clouds. Tarantino has frequently cited these sequences as transformative to his understanding of action cinema. What particularly resonates with Tarantino is Peckinpah's exploration of men whose time has passed. The film opens with children gleefully watching scorpions being devoured by ants, a metaphor for both the audience's relationship to screen violence and the bunch's position in a world where horseback outlaws face automobiles and machine guns. The film's famous final walk, the bunch striding towards certain death, represents cinema's perfect distillation of fatalistic courage. As Holden tells his men, "Let's go," a simple line transformed into an existential statement about facing annihilation on one's own terms. The Man Who Shot Liberty Valance, 1962. When the legend becomes fact, print the legend. This iconic line from John Ford's elegiac 1962 Western could serve as Tarantino's own artistic manifesto. Shot in stark black and white when color westerns were standard, the film represents Ford's most sophisticated examination of how the West was won, not just with guns, but with myths and narratives that often obscured uncomfortable truths. Jimmy Stewart plays Ransom Stoddard, an Eastern lawyer who gains fame for supposedly killing notorious outlaw Liberty Valance. John Wayne's Tom Doniphan represents the Western hero rendered obsolete by the civilization Stoddard brings. The film's central revelation that Wayne actually shot Valance from the shadows becomes a powerful metaphor for how history simplifies complex realities. What captivates Tarantino about this film is its metafictional quality. Ford was essentially making a movie about how his own westerns had created mythologies that weren't entirely true, Tarantino explained. It's a film about filmmaking itself. This self-awareness about genre conventions would later become a hallmark of Tarantino's work. The film's visual restraint, shooting on sound stages rather than Monument Valley, creates an intentional artificiality that underscores its themes. The West of memory and myth rather than historical reality. Edith Head's costumes further emphasize this contrast, with Wayne's rugged buckskin set against Stewart's Eastern propriety. What particularly distinguishes Liberty Valance is its melancholic tone. Ford, nearing the end of his career, seems to be grappling with his own role in creating the Western mythology. When the final flashback ends and we return to the present, the sense of loss is palpable, both for the characters and for the Western itself, as a viable American art form. For Tarantino, the film represents the Western's most profound meditation on itself. It's Ford admitting that sometimes the stories we tell matter more than what actually happened, which is basically what I do in all my historical films. The Great Silence, 1968. The most brutally nihilistic Western ever made. Tarantino doesn't mince words when describing Sergio Corbucci's 1968 masterpiece, a film whose bleak worldview and shocking conclusion continue to disturb audiences decades later. Set in the snow-covered mountains of Utah, a radical departure from the sun-baked landscapes typical of the genre, The Great Silence represents the spaghetti western at its most politically charged and morally complex. Jean-Louis Trintignant plays the titular Silence, a mute gunfighter hunting bounty hunters who killed his family. His nemesis, the sadistic Loco, is portrayed with chilling glee by Klaus Kinski in one of his most memorable performances. What distinguishes the film is Corbucci's refusal to provide the cathartic violence that Western audiences expect, instead delivering an ending so shocking that American distributors initially refused to release the film. What fascinates Tarantino is how Corbucci inverts Western conventions. The hero's muteness serves as a powerful metaphor for the voiceless oppressed. The snow-covered setting transforms familiar Western iconography into something alien and hostile. Even Ennio Morricone's score avoids traditional Western motifs in favor of a haunting, melancholic theme. The film's politics remain startlingly relevant. Bounty hunters target the poor and marginalized with legal impunity, protected by corrupt institutions. When a black sheriff attempts to uphold justice, he's brutally dispatched. This systemic critique clearly influenced Tarantino's own Django Unchained, which pays direct homage to Corbucci's unflinching vision. Most remarkable is the film's legendary ending, which Tarantino calls the most courageous conclusion in Western history. Without spoiling it entirely, Silence's confrontation with Loco ends not with heroic triumph, but with something far more disturbing, a denial of justice that forces viewers to confront the often ugly historical realities behind Western mythology. Corbucci understood that sometimes the bad guys won, Tarantino noted. That's what makes this film feel more honest than 100 Hollywood Westerns with their neat moral conclusions. The Professionals, 1966. A perfect machine of a movie, every part working in precise harmony. This is how Tarantino describes Richard Brooks's 1966 adventure western, a film that combines classical Hollywood craftsmanship with the moral complexity emerging in the genre during that pivotal decade. What particularly appeals to Tarantino is the film's balance of traditional Western thrills with sophisticated character dynamics and unexpected narrative turns. The premise is deceptively simple. Millionaire J.W. Grant hires 4 specialists to rescue his wife from Mexican revolutionary Jesus Raza. The team consists of explosives expert Bill Dallworth, weapons specialist Henry Rico, horse wrangler Hans Ehrengard, and tracker Jake Sharp. What makes the film special is how it continually subverts expectations about its characters and their mission. What Tarantino particularly admires is Brooks's economic storytelling. Each character is established with remarkable efficiency. Marvin testing a rifle's accuracy, Lancaster blowing up an oil well, Ryan calming a wild horse. These wordless sequences tell us everything we need to know about these men's capabilities and temperaments. The film's visual language deserves special mention. Cinematographer Conrad Hall captures the harsh southwestern landscapes with a beauty that nonetheless conveys their danger. Shooting in Death Valley and Valley of Fire State Park, Hall creates images of painterly composition that influenced Tarantino's own approach to Western landscapes in Django Unchained. The film's most subversive element comes in its third act. When the professionals discover that Maria wasn't kidnapped at all, she fled willingly to return to her former lover Raza. This moral complication transforms a straightforward rescue mission into something far more nuanced, forcing the characters to reconsider their loyalties and motivations. Lancaster's final line to Bellamy's corrupt businessman, "Rico, you want to come back for the reward?" represents the perfect distillation of the film's sardonic view of honor in a world where money typically trumps morality. It's precisely this blend of entertainment and ethical complexity that Tarantino seeks in his own filmmaking. The Tall T, 1957. Bud Boetticher and Randolph Scott created westerns so pure they're practically haiku. Tarantino's appreciation for this 1957 gem speaks to his fascination with genre filmmakers who achieved greatness within tight constraints. Running a lean 78 minutes and shot in just 20 days, The Tall T demonstrates how limitations can produce remarkable artistic focus. Based on an Elmore Leonard story, the film follows rancher Pat Brennan, who gets caught up in a stagecoach hijacking led by calculating outlaw Frank Usher. What distinguishes the film is its emphasis on character over action. Long stretches consist simply of people talking, their dialogues revealing complex moral shadings that transcend simplistic hero-villain dynamics. What particularly captivates Tarantino is Boetticher's visual economy. Every composition serves the story, with the Rocky Alabama Hills locations becoming a character in themselves. This efficiency extends to the storytelling. The film's shocking opening act concludes with the slaying of a stagecoach driver and his young passenger, their deaths occurring off-screen, but conveyed with chilling effectiveness through sound and reaction shots. Richard Boone's Frank Usher ranks among Western cinema's most complex villains, intelligent, articulate, and oddly honorable within his own moral framework. He forms a grudging respect for Scott's Brennan that complicates their inevitable confrontation. This relationship clearly influenced the dynamic between Christoph Waltz and Jamie Foxx in Tarantino's Django Unchained. Randolph Scott's performance represents the culmination of his screen persona, the weathered, laconic cowboy whose still waters run deep. At 59 during filming, Scott brings a lived-in quality to Brennan that younger actors couldn't have achieved. His minimalist acting style creates a fascinating contrast with Boone's more expressive approach. The film belongs to what critics call the renown cycle, 7 westerns Boetticher, made with Scott and producer Harry Joe Brown. Tarantino considers these films collectively as the most underappreciated body of work in American cinema, perfect little diamonds that influenced everyone from Peckinpah to Eastwood to me. Johnny Guitar, 1954. The Western as fever dream, a technicolor eruption of repressed desires and gender subversion. Tarantino's description of Nicholas Ray's 1954 cult classic captures what makes this film so startlingly unique. Ostensibly a Western, Johnny Guitar plays more like melodrama filtered through surrealism, creating what Tarantino calls a Western for people who think they don't like Westerns. Joan Crawford stars as Vienna, a saloon owner whose establishment sits on land coveted by cattle baron Emma Small. The titular Johnny Guitar is Vienna's former lover, hired ostensibly for his musical abilities, but really to provide protection against Emma's escalating threats. What makes the film revolutionary is how it reconfigures Western gender dynamics. The primary conflict isn't between men, but between two powerful women. What fascinates Tarantino is Ray's expressionistic approach. The film's heightened colors, stylized dialogue, and operatic emotions create a Western universe unlike any other. Vienna's saloon, built into a rock face with an incongruous chandelier and piano, epitomizes the film's blend of Western iconography and flamboyant artifice. The film's sexual politics remain remarkably progressive. Vienna wears pants and runs her business with unflinching authority, while Emma's hatred barely disguises obsessive attraction. As Tarantino noted, Ray understood that Westerns had always been about repression. He just decided to bring all that subtext right to the surface. The film's initial reception proved troubled. Many critics dismissed it as lurid and excessive. François Truffaut and other European critics recognized its brilliance first, appreciating how Ray was using genre conventions to explore psychological territory, typically absent from Westerns. This critical rehabilitation parallels Tarantino's own career-long championing of misunderstood genre films. Perhaps most remarkable is the film's fiery climax, where Vienna and Emma's confrontation reaches its inevitable conclusion. Crawford and McCambridge's real-life hatred for each other infuses their performances with authentic venom, creating what Tarantino describes as the Western's most thrilling gunfight. And it's between two women, which was revolutionary then and would still be revolutionary now. Red River, 1948. The Western that proved John Wayne could really act. Tarantino's appreciation for Howard Hawks' 1948 epic speaks to his understanding of how the film transformed Wayne from Western star to genuine dramatic actor. Often compared to Mutiny on the Bounty, transplanted to the cattle trails, the film explores themes of generational conflict, leadership, and American expansion with remarkable sophistication. Wayne plays Thomas Dunson, a ruthlessly determined rancher driving his cattle from Texas to Missouri along the Chisholm Trail. As the journey progresses, Dunson's tyrannical leadership alienates the men, particularly his surrogate son, Matthew Garth. Their inevitable confrontation forms the emotional core of what Tarantino calls the most Shakespearean of all Westerns. What particularly impresses Tarantino is Hawks' mastery of scale. The film alternates between intimate character moments and spectacular sequences involving thousands of cattle and dozens of riders. The river crossing scene, where the herd nearly stampedes, remains one of cinema's most technically impressive achievements, influencing similar sequences in everything from The Lion King to Tarantino's own Django Unchained. The casting of Clift opposite Wayne creates fascinating tension. Wayne's muscular, domineering presence contrasts with Clift's more introspective, modernist acting style. This clash of performance approaches perfectly embodies the film's generational conflict, old frontier values versus a more progressive, compassionate vision of the West. Particularly notable is the film's complex portrayal of masculine relationships. The surrogate father-son dynamic between Wayne and Clift carries surprising emotional weight, while Walter Brennan's Groot provides both comic relief and moral conscience. When Dunson tells Garth, "You're good enough to work for me," it functions simultaneously as the highest praise and as evidence of his inability to fully express paternal love. The film's famous ending, where Hawks steps back from the tragic conclusion of the source novel, remains controversial. Tarantino defends it. Hawks understood that Westerns are ultimately about American mythology. The reconciliation might feel abrupt, but it serves the film's deeper exploration of how violent men eventually make way for civilization. Unforgiven, 1992. The ultimate deconstruction of the Western myth by the man who embodied that myth. Tarantino's assessment of Clint Eastwood's 1992 masterpiece acknowledges how the film functions as both eulogy and critique of the genre that made Eastwood a star. Released when many considered the Western dead, Unforgiven breathed new life into the form precisely by questioning its fundamental moral assumptions. Eastwood plays William Money, a reformed outlaw and widower who takes one final job to provide for his children. Accompanied by his old partner, Ned Logan, and the boastful Schofield Kid, Money pursues a bounty on two cowboys who disfigured a prostitute. What distinguishes the film is its unflinching examination of violence, not as spectacle but as moral catastrophe that damages perpetrator and victim alike. What particularly resonates with Tarantino is Eastwood's willingness to subvert his own screen persona. Eastwood spent decades building a certain type of Western hero, Tarantino noted, then used this film to show how that archetype was built on self-serving mythology. When Money finally reverts to his violent ways, it's presented not as triumph, but as spiritual desolation. Gene Hackman's Little Bill Daggett represents one of cinema's most complex antagonists, a brutal sheriff who nonetheless believes he's bringing civilization to a lawless town. His confrontations with Money create what Tarantino calls the Western's perfect moral stalemate, two men justified by their own codes, but damned by any objective moral standard. David Webb. People's screenplay deserves special mention for its poetic dialogue that manages to feel both period-appropriate and philosophical. For Tarantino, this sequence represents the Western coming full circle, the genre finally confronting the moral cost of the mythology it spent a century creating. Day of the Outlaw, 1959. The most beautifully bleak Western ever made. Tarantino's championing of André de Toth's 1959 snowbound Western speaks to his appreciation for the genre's overlooked masterpieces. Shot in stark black and white against Oregon's winter landscapes, the film transforms familiar Western iconography into something alien and hostile, a frozen hell where moral compromises prove as inevitable as the killing cold. Robert Ryan plays Blaze Sterrett, a rancher planning to eliminate local farmer Hal Crane, who has fenced off the open range and married the woman Starrett loves. This standard Western conflict is upended when Jack Brune, a wounded cavalry captain turned outlaw, arrives with his gang of desperate men, holding the town hostage while seeking medical attention. What particularly captivates Tarantino is how the film uses its harsh winter setting to externalize its moral landscape. De Toth understood that environment shapes morality, Tarantino explained. The snow doesn't just create striking visuals, it forces characters into impossible choices. The final sequence, where Starrett leads the outlaws into a mountain blizzard, ranks among cinema's most harrowing depictions of nature's indifference to human suffering. Ryan's performance deserves special mention. His Starrett begins as a bitter, vengeful man, but discovers unexpected heroism when confronted with a greater evil. The actor's weathered face becomes a map of moral recalculation. His initial grievances rendered petty by Brune's men and their capacity for casual cruelty. Burl Ives, best known for folk singing and voice acting, delivers a performance of surprising menace as Brune. Maintaining control over his men through sheer force of will, while slowly dying from a bullet wound, Brune represents what Tarantino calls the Western's most human villain, a bad man trying to prevent his men from becoming something worse. The film's visual style, influenced by film noir as much as Western traditions, creates a claustrophobic atmosphere rare in the typically expansive genre. De Toth's camera captures faces in harsh shadow and landscapes in disorienting whiteouts, creating what Tarantino describes as the perfect visual equivalent of moral ambiguity, a world where clear sightlines are impossible, both literally and figuratively. From snow-swept mountains to sun-baked deserts, these 13 films capture what made Tarantino fall in love with the Western, its moral complexity disguised as simple entertainment. These weren't just movies that influenced him. They were his education in how cinema can transform myth into art. What Western films have shaped your perspective? Let us know in the comments. Like and subscribe for more deep dives into the films that made our favorite filmmakers. Until next time, keep watching the classics that still have something to say.